Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, editor of ForbesWomen. The 2024 presidential election is 60 days away, and right now, Vice President Kamala Harris is leading among Black voters compared with Donald Trump. However, is she leading enough? And will this constituency spur her to the White House? Joining us now to discuss this and so much more is LaTosha Brown. She is the co-founder of Black Voters Matter Fund, and she is also on the 2024 50 over 50 impact list. LaTosha, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me for this conversation.
So let's just start for folks who aren't familiar with the Black Voters Matter Fund. What is it? What do you do?
We're a power building organization that was founded in 2016 by myself and my co-founder, Cliff Albright. And the goal of our organization is really the quickest way to understand it is there are three kind of core pieces that we want to do. We want to move more money. We want to actually build out the ecosystem of movement organizations that are doing this work. And then we want to make sure that we're shaping a message that gives people hope, a message that inspires people to be civically engaged in their communities around power and what power building looks like. And so over the last almost 7 years, we've invested, raised, and reinvested over $40 million to grassroots groups on the ground doing this work. We've actually done a lot of work in our states that we have 12 states that we work with ongoing, that we're literally moving and working with 20 to up to 120 organizations in each of those states to help strengthen the ecosystem. And then we're literally leaning into this message of hope and using our imaginations, using our work and our innovation to bring the kind of nation that we desire and we deserve.
How has the work changed this summer? Because, of course, we started the summer with one candidate for the Democratic Party and ended the summer with an entirely different nominee. Has that affected the way you've approached this work, or are you looking kind of from a nonpartisan angle and just getting folks registered to vote, understanding when and how they should vote, and basic voting rights access information?
Well, we have multiple organizations, and one is a C3, one is a C4. But what I'll say is that the nature of the work, I think the core foundation of the work stays the same, but I will certainly say that when you're doing voter work and you have an energized base, when you have a different element that has shifted the momentum, that certainly is going to impact all of us. And so what I will say is that a race that I think when we started out earlier in the year, that I often said, this is not the election that people are going to be excited. This is the election that we've got to recognize and we've got to ignite people. We have got to get people ignited and wanting to participate in this election. Things changed, as you said, even like a couple of weeks ago, things have shifted from literally, it has become exciting. That what you're seeing, what we're hearing from voters and people on the ground, there's a certain level of excitement, there's a certain level of hope, there's a certain level of believing that literally this is something that we can collectively do. This is a certain level of, I think, groups, different constituency groups being energized in a particular kind of way. And so that has absolutely had a dramatic impact, not just on the field, but even in our work in terms of that momentum, the level of volunteers, the level of people who want to give resources, the level of people who really have a sense of hope and want to figure out how we push forward, that in itself has had a tremendous difference, I think, on the temperature that we're seeing on the field.
Oh, that's interesting. There's been a lot of talk about the vibe shift that happened this summer, which is kind of a loose term, but from your perspective, LaTosha, has that vibe shift translated into more grassroots organizers, more people registering to vote?
Oh, absolutely. There are three pieces in all of those things that you said. One, in terms of volunteers, just on my phone alone, my niece, who I have been personally, who I've been trying to get involved in voting for the last 3 years. It was like, matter of fact, I would have to push her just on voting, not just to volunteer, called me and was like, I want to volunteer. So she went from beyond, I'm going to vote, what can I do, Auntie? Right. And so I've been seeing kind of that trend of young women really being excited and engaged in this election cycle. What we know is that the percentage that young women, it is almost 200%, 175% increase of young Black women who have registered in this particular election cycle. What we know is not just in the registration, the number of volunteers, people saying that they want to volunteer, has also shifted as well. And so I think, and then when you look at kind of social media all around us, I think young people are literally back in this election cycle. They're back paying attention. They're saying that they want to be involved and engaged. We saw that in 2020, right? And then we've seen in the recent years, we've actually seen a decline in that, particularly this last year. What we're seeing now is an uptick on young people who want to be engaged in this process, who are volunteering, who are coming into this process with a level of excitement and a level of interest.
What are the issues that are motivating these voters? And of course, recognizing that Black voters are not a monolith, but what are you hearing from the folks on the ground? Is it just that they're excited about Vice President Harris, or are they telling you that they like her policy positions, or conversely, are they excited about Donald Trump? What are the specifics you're hearing?
Yeah, I think one, while there is a certain level of excitement around the candidate, I think it goes beyond the candidate, even Vice President Kamala Harris, or even if you were referring to Donald Trump. I think ultimately what people are seeing, people have a pathway to hope. I think there is an appetite, I think in the country, when I'm talking to people, that when I say folks don't, the people that I meet that don't engage, they're usually people who don't feel like they matter, or they're people that don't feel like them participating in this process is going to have a remarkable difference, and so they disengage. I don't call them apathetic. They just disengage because they're not able to make the connection or see a pathway to hope around the things they care about. What I am noticing as I'm talking to people, I'm talking to more people that believe that there's something that they can do in this moment, that there's a pathway to hope. One of the pieces that I think has engaged and energized women, all women across the board, has been the attack on reproductive freedom and reproductive rights. Regardless of whether people, where they are on the question around abortion, do they believe it and they don't believe it, everybody that I've spoken with believe that women should have the same kind of authority and agency over their body, that is a decision between a woman, her doctor, and her God, however she puts it, right? But that is her decision. That should not be a decision of government interfering in the lives of women or really trying to restrain what women's agency. And so that has activated, particularly young women. That is one of the single biggest issues I think that has activated young women around reproductive freedom, reproductive health and justice. The second thing is really around, I think what COVID did is I think COVID had people created a certain level of anxiety around economic sustainability and our economic futures. And so as we've been talking to Black voters in particular, they're really concerned about, are there going to be policies? They're looking at and witnessing and experiencing, seeing programs like affirmative action be discarded. Those very things that many of our parents, like my parents actually benefited from, even the ability to be able to go to college, even the ability to actually be able to start businesses and have some success at that. A lot of those things were actually shaped by policies that we're seeing being unraveled. I also think that there's a big piece around cost, even the way that we see the health of the economy, that Black voters, when they're talking about the health of the economy, it's not based on how well the GDP is doing. It's not based on what the unemployment rate. It's really around day-to-day kitchen table issues. It's really around bread. I say it's bread, eggs, and cheese, of milk. Ultimately, what the cost of things are, what my security in terms of my job security, my ability to make resources, and my ability to be able to get access to home ownership. And so what we're hearing is one candidate is really not talking about there's another candidate that is actually speaking on those issues. And that in itself, I think, is also activating people. The third thing that when we're talking about Black voters as well is that racism is traumatic for our community, that literally seeing and having an alignment around, we're seeing book bans, we're seeing this idea of Black history can't be taught in school, right? That's not just an external issue. That's an issue that many people in my community, many Black voters actually see as an attack on on who we are, just who we are and our right to exist and to share our stories. And so that in itself has also created a level of anxiety around. That's a core issue that people, particularly Black voters, want to really be able to make sure that there's someone that's governing that can govern for all of us, that there's someone that's governing that we're literally not going to be the scapegoat, we're not going to be the casualty of war, but that in fact, that there would be some idea of parity and equity in this process or thought around that. So that's what I see as well. And then criminal justice reform, that as we kind of continue to go forward in this election cycle over and over again, there were a generation of voters who were brought into this process after the George Floyd uprisings, right? And as a result, those voters, those young voters, they have a whole different way of the way they see the world. They don't have the same kind of sense of party loyalty to either party as their predecessors. They also, what I call them, the Janet Jackson, what have you done for me lately generation? They're literally looking at policies to the extent of how will these policies materially impact my life. In some ways, I think they're more sophisticated voters in terms of what they're looking for as outcomes.
That's interesting. So just to summarize those policies that are motivating the voters you're speaking to, I heard prices, right? Inflation, the economy, but on a micro level, what does it mean for day-to-day life? Bodily autonomy, healthcare, home affordability, which I guess healthcare falls under, criminal justice. These are important issues. And actually, I have a poll in front of me from The Economist and YouGov, and that found, to your point about some people not being sure, 7% of the Black voters that The Economist and YouGov polled said that they're not sure who they would vote for right now. 72% said that they're in favor of Vice President Kamala Harris, and 18% said that they are in favor of former President Donald Trump. How do those numbers sound to you? And is any one of those figures concerning to you at this point in time with 60 days remaining until the election?
Well, on one hand, it's concerning for personal reasons, because at this point, it's really challenging for me to see how voters would see someone who has aligned themselves with white supremacists and has lifted up policies to be hurtful to not only, I think, the African-American communities, but many of our communities, I think. So, but the truth of the matter is the poll isn't surprising to me. And the reason why it's not surprising me, because I do think on some level it falls in line with the trends that what I think ultimately what you're going to see, that we are not a monolith, and there are people who have different reasons, and I think they should in terms of that choices. But overwhelmingly, when you look at the Black vote, overwhelmingly, that meant 80%. Of almost 80%. And I think ultimately when it washes out, that's what you're going to see, that are literally are voting for what they think is the collective interest, and who's going to work and align themselves better with I believe some policies that are more reflective to our interests. But then there are, like I said, like you said, there is a spectrum of beliefs and ideologies on at this point. And so I think that falls in the line of what has happened throughout the years. There's always been 12 to 15% of Black voters. Mm-hmm. So I don't see what I push back on is this idea that number has grown drastically, and it has not grown. It actually always hovers around that number. And I think that to that extent, I think that's why it's important to do the work for people to get the information out there so that they can make an educated choice. And I think people know what to do.
It's interesting you mentioned that you're frustrated that people are harping on that 1 or 2% change in Black support for former President Trump, because I was about to read you a headline which reads, "Kamala Harris has a massive lead among Black voters. It may not be enough." That's from Newsweek. And it's talking about how Black voters are an important coalition for Vice President Harris, and yet Republicans have gained ground with this group in 2020, and they're maintaining some of that support this cycle. And if that translates to 1 or 2% of the voters in a swing state that would have voted for the Democratic Party are now voting for the Republican Party, that could affect the outcome of this election. How are you thinking about Black voters, particularly those in swing states, and that 1 to 2% that might be changing their vote compared to 2016 or 2020?
Well, thank you for that question. There are 3 quick thoughts. My first thought is there are more people participating in the process. In the 2020 election, there were more people voted that ever voted in the history of this country. And as more people vote, I think you'll get a more diversity of ideas and positions that people take. And so by the nature of that, 1 or 2% of growth, I think is just the nature of democracy itself, the nature of more people participating in the process, right? That's one piece. The second piece, though, is I think that as a voting base, there's not another constituency group in America that votes as a high percentage of Black voters. And so I think that it is unfair, unjust, and quite frankly, quite racist that the statement around this idea that Black voters, all 100% of Black voters, the expectation have to vote for a particular party. There's no expectation of any other group of people that will do that. And with even given that we vote at higher rate as a percentage block than any other group, only second to Black men. And so I think this expectation that we all have to go one particular way, I think it's also an anomaly, and I think it comes out of a particular kind of frame. And so I actually push back against that. The third piece, though, I think is like, I think polls give you a sense of a temperature. I think what we see on election day, and I heard the same thing in Georgia, in the Georgia Senate race with Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker. There was supposed to be this big flood of Black men that were going to go vote for Herschel Walker. We never saw it, right? Yeah. So that what we saw is we saw a very robust election, right? That we saw an election that when you go back and you look at the numbers literally fell in line. There was some growth, but the electorate itself has grown, right? That it was more in alignment with what we've seen in years, with some growth in that space. And so part of what I believe is, I don't believe that we're in I think that it's not also the responsibility of Black people by ourselves to save democracy. I think that it is unreasonable to believe that every single Black person in America is going to always vote for the same person or the same way, right? What that actually likens itself is as if we don't have even diversity of thought and ideas, even in our own communities, right? Even though I find it deeply troubling at this point. I don't know why anybody would support a platform that actually aligns itself with white supremacy and white nationalism. That's very challenging. But again, that is a choice. And so I say that to say that I think that the notion that I think what we're going to see is really around turnout. And I think Black women are going to drive that turnout. And I think when you look at the numbers, the explosion of young Black women who are coming to the table, I think you have to take that into account as well, that there are more young people, there are more people who are coming to this process and coming to the table, and for specific reasons in this specific moment. And I think that that's going to make the difference. I think where the focus should be is getting as many people engaged as possible in this election. And I actually trust the people to actually be able to get the kind of outcome that ultimately they want, that we desire and we deserve. And then you combine that, when you're looking at that, that's one piece. But then when you're looking at, there's also death by 1,000 cuts. We've been seeing voter suppression bills, over 300 different bills throughout the nation around voter suppression that is designed to actually try to minimize the power of the vote and to shave off a few here, shave off a few there. But that's in response to more people are participating. That is in response to their young people and other people engaged in this process that have not normally been engaged in the process. So while, yes, there are these challenges on one hand, on the other hand, what I see is a tremendous amount of possibilities and potential that are with the electorate and the landscape, the political landscape shifting.
You raised a really good point about Black voters being expected to basically carry the burden of electoral hopes. And we see that across industries and even outside of elections, right? It's Black creatives are asked about, can you comment on the state of diversity in Hollywood? And it's, everyone should be asked these questions and should go to the polls. But as you mentioned, voter suppression, obviously 300 is a very high number. Are there specific cases that you are especially worried about at this point in time in early September that Black Voters Matter is addressing and trying to undo as we head faster towards November?
Some of this, I think there are a couple of things. I think one of what we've seen just happen, which is a cumulative over the last decade, quite frankly, is literally the chipping away of voting rights protections in this country. And so part of what we have been doing and continue to do is to educate and actually advocate around, we need stronger voting rights protection in this country. And in the form of, there are two laws that we want to see passed. It's the John Lewis Voter Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. And we've been doing a lot of work to lift up and educate people around those pieces of legislation and actually push and want folks to literally think about who is going to support, to making sure that there is Kamala Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris has made a commitment that if she is elected, those are two pieces of legislation she will sign, right? And so that's really important to us, because what we have seen is like death by 1,000 cuts. We've seen these different laws passed that from I'll give an example of just here in the state of Georgia, which is my home state, that right after the 2022 election, what we saw is the passage of a bill called Senate Bill 202. In that bill, it does a number of things. It criminalizes groups that are helping, that are at, while people are standing in line for 2, 3, 4 hours. We were at a site one night that people stayed in line. The last person voted at 12:37 a.m. in the morning, Wednesday. Right. So to that kind of egregiousness around people standing in line for hours, we would provide in other groups water or pizza or chairs, just what we call comfort care. And so that has become illegal in the state of Georgia. Just to give someone a bottle of water is now illegal and literally it's considered a felony. That at the end of the day, what we're also seeing is that using absentee ballot boxes, that voting boxes, that literally that was very effective. It was it came about, or at least expanded right after, during Katrina. I mean, Lord Jesus, the use of ballot boxes expanded during COVID. And so it was very effective for rural areas, for people with disabilities, with people who don't have traditional work hours, that was very effective. And so what this bill did, it essentially says, wait a minute, this worked a little bit too well. So now what we're going to do is reduce the number. We're going to reduce the thing that actually worked. And we're only going to have one box every 100,000 people, which that in itself impacts rural areas, which fundamentally the whole idea was to create in the state of Georgia. It was created and lifted by Republicans who wanted to make sure that their constituents in rural areas had the opportunity, right? But as it expanded and people used it during COVID, that it became another, then all of a sudden, now it doesn't have the same level of importance, and there's been a change because it was effective. And so we're seeing this all over the place. Everything from, I think a most recent issue of concern is in the state of Georgia in this last month. What we've seen legislation crop up that gives the Republican Party in the state of Georgia, it gives them the power to certify or to delay the certification of results. This is the same. So if an election official sees the results and say, it's something about this I just don't like, or something I don't think, it delays the process. So now it creates a process that literally our election results may not get certified timely. That all of that creates this air of suspicion. All this creates this air of confusion and allows itself, in terms of election deniers, can actually utilize that moment. And so we're fearful of that, because this is the same state that President Trump wanted to find 11,000 votes. With this in place, it actually creates an opportunity to make it easier to buy time to find those votes. And so those are the kinds of things. And I think what you see is on both sides. I think that there are Republicans and Democrats in Georgia that are actually questioning whether that was a good move in terms of protecting democracy and the integrity of the election.
LaTosha, I'm going to have to let you go in just a few minutes because we've blown past the end of what I said was the interview time. But I want to ask one more thing that came up before we started recording, which is that over the past several weeks, Kamala Harris has been compared to former President Obama as a historic candidate. They share certain identities, and you have said that this comparison is a little frustrating. Can you share with our audience why you find that comparison unproductive?
Yeah, I think that let me say this. Of course, we are forever proud of I'm forever proud of President Obama. And I think he ran an amazing campaign, but I think I think there's a distinction in her campaign. And I think the frustration is not so much around comparing his campaign, because I think he ran one of the best campaigns that we've seen in this country, but it's really around overlooking how she distinctively has a different role, that she's distinctively doing something different. In the Obama campaign, what I saw is a campaign that was centered around this idea of, yes, we can, we're all Americans, we'll rally behind this candidate, and we're going to support him, right? In her campaign, I think there's a really important distinction around that. In her campaign, it has opened up a space for people to own their different identities and organize with the idea of the same goal. We want to move forward, but that we don't have to say that we're the same. That I'm the childless cat lady. Oh no, I'm the white dude. I am the truckers for for Harris. I am the Black women for Harris. It opens up a space that is really more reflective around the inclusivity and the diversity and celebrating the diversity of America, not feeling like we have to literally boil down to this single person, right? But ultimately that it is that diversity is not our burden, but it is our blessing. And so what I've been seeing is I've been seeing communities, the Swifties for Harris. I've been seeing people literally organized around their identities, right? In a way that says we're all in alignment around we want to progress this country and we don't have to give up who we are. That's a really powerful frame. I also think that the difference around how she has to navigate not only race, but gender as well. That at the end of the day, I mean, here she did not have the protection of being a man, a gender as Obama. She did not have the protection of being a white person, even as Hillary Clinton, even though I think she had her share of challenges just because she was a woman candidate as well. She's had to navigate at the intersection of which I think Black women often find ourselves sitting. And so I think it's really interesting, even in a recent interview where she was asked on her CNN interview, when she was asked to respond to Trump questioning her identity, I felt like her response was brilliant. And the reason why I thought her response was brilliant, it did three things. And I often talk about this, that racism, part of the strategy of racism is to make people question their own identity, to make you have to justify your humanity. They have to justify who you are. I think what we saw in her response is a couple of things. One, that she's in tune to that Americans have moved forward, that he represents an America of the past. She represents America of now and the future. Secondly, that she literally is above that question, that she's no longer as represented as a woman of color, that she does not have to justify her existence, that she does not have to justify her humanity. She does not have to prove who she is or explain who she is to anyone, that she believes that her work and her presence will do that for her. And I really applaud her on that. And the third thing is, I think oftentimes we give too much power, too much space for things that we know are untrue, that are false, or that are really created around racist or sexist tropes. And then we get caught up in this vortex of just responding instead of literally going to what I say, I learned from one of my favorite songs by Stevie Wonder, going to higher ground. And so I think with her answer, she went to higher ground and said, nope, we're going to send, you are not going to determine who I am. And I am not going to respond to that. I am going to go to higher ground and talk about what really matters to Americans.
LaTosha Brown, co-founder of Black Voters Matter Fund. Thank you so much for being here. We so appreciate your time and insight, and you'll have to come back as we get closer to the election.
Thank you for having me.